Thank you, and thank you for attending. I want to say thanks particularly to our morning people in the Pacific, the people domestically in the United States, and for people like myself that are in Europe. We're doing an evening show here. So look at the first slide. I'm Michael Sedge, president of the Michael-Bruno Group. We are a U.S. small business. We started our company in 2003. I've actually been in Europe working with and for the U.S. government for the past 40 years. But we set up our business specifically not to work in the United States. And as we grew, we opened an Italian company. We opened a Bahrain company, as well as a company in East Africa in Djibouti. So most of what I'll be covering today is based on my experience in Europe, Middle East, but the international host nation compliance is actually a global phenomena that the U.S. government started a few years back, and I'll give you a little history on that. Moving to the next slide, host nation compliance actually started in the mid to late 90s when Department of Defense realized that what they were building was basically based on U.S. code. A good example, that was about the time that Germany, there was some reconfiguration, the military was downsizing, and the U.S. government was turning over facilities to the local nationals. And they were finding that none of the facilities, or most of the facilities, did not meet the German DIN code for electrical as well as a few others. Myself, I was involved in a project in Italy. It was a DISA teleport program which was global, and I was responsible for getting a license at Lago Patria, the Navy SATCOM, and I went to the Minister of Telecommunications in Italy, and they said, well, this is a government project facility, so we'll turn you over to the Minister of Defense. I went to the Minister of Defense, and I said, you know, we need a license to transmit from a satellite terminal. And he said, where is that? I said, at Lago Patria, Naples. We have no record of any military installation in Lago Patria. So that started the whole dilemma in Italy, and ultimately all of this movement, simultaneous movement, basically resulted in mixed commissions for each country, host nation commissions, so that most of the international facilities now have some kind of a host nation as well as U.S. government commission to review all projects, all designs. On the long term, the U.S. government said this will be good to implement because as we move forward, if we have to turn over a facility to the host nation, we know it's compliant. We don't have to reinvest more money to bring it up to local code. So that's a little of the history of how we got into this. The problem has been over the last 10 years, everyone has a different opinion of what it really means to be host nation compliant when you're designing and constructing overseas. Now, the host nation's point of view is, great, we have an agreement. The U.S. government is going to build everything according to our codes, our regulations, our laws. The U.S. government's point of view is, okay, we need to provide a code compliance chart in the design that basically does a comparison against the host nation laws, the U.S. laws, and will apply the most stringent. Now, when it gets down to the RFP requirements, which the contractor is interested in, it basically says you'll comply with all host nation law, all host nation codes, norms, as well as U.S., UFC, IBC, and all the other codes that basically are needed in U.S. government construction. So this creates a little problem because government's view does not actually meet what the RFP requirements are. So basically, it impacts 5 key areas when they put those host nation requirements in an RFP. Number one, it eliminates, in most cases, all U.S. firms from the competition. Number two, it doubles your design challenges and increases cost. It increases construction challenges and cost. It increases safety challenges and cost. And it puts the contractor into a dual legal system. And let me go into each one of these a little bit more in detail. When I say it eliminates most U.S. firms, normally host nations have specific requirements that a company has to have to do construction in their country. So as soon as, let's take an example in Italy that I'm very familiar with, as soon as the U.S. government puts that little phrase in there that says, the contractor must comply with host nation regulations, or must be host nation required. Basically, that means that you have to follow Italian laws if you're bidding a project in Italy, which means you have to be registered in the Chamber of Commerce, and you can only do that if you have a local company, and you have to provide all certificates that you're paying all your employees, and more specifically, they have a SOA certification here. They have in just about every country, but it's called different. The SOA certification is basically a government-issued, let's say, a permit that allows a company to do construction in certain sectors at certain levels. For example, electrical. You may do a project and do $2 million worth of electrical work. Once that project is completed, you can submit that to, in this case, the Italian government. The Italian government will review it. They'll look at the documents, everything's in order. They will give you a certificate that says you're certified to do electrical work up to $2 million. So you can't bid on work for 5, but you can do 2. So when you're bidding a project in Italy, the U.S. government requires these certifications, which U.S. companies cannot obtain. So the only way that a U.S. firm can work in anywhere in Europe, as well as some countries in the Pacific, is that they have to joint venture with a partner in those countries. This requires long-range planning and commitment because you cannot do a joint venture in Europe in a matter of months. I mean, we're talking probably a matter of, 6 or 7 months, because you're a U.S. company and you are an international company. So it requires long-term planning. And if you're going to go after, if you're a U.S. company and you plan to go after international work, start working and finding those partners. Or if you're really obligated, and most companies are not until they win a contract, you can open up a company in that country, but you still have to find the partners to work with so you can have all these certifications. The double design challenges. We've worked with many design companies. We've been a host nation compliance partner for HDR, for Stanley Consulting, for many companies. And basically, if you're a U.S. design firm, and let's say you win an A&E contract in the Pacific, you're going to have to find a host nation partner that has engineers, architects registered in those countries, because they will be required to do all the host nation certifications, stamping the designs, signing the designs. So basically, you're creating a double team for every project you're doing, and that's going to increase your cost, increase your quality control, and increase your delivery time. Host nation compliance reports. As I talked about, the government says you have to do a chart, and you say U.S. code, host nation code. That's going to have to be done by your host nation partner. There's going to be times when you're going to have dual language requirements. You're going to have dual measurement requirements. You're going to be using metrics. Your host nation DOR is going to have to stamp and sign everything, in addition to the U.S. company that's doing the design, stamping and signing. Now, our company, fortunately, we are a U.S. company, but we also are a Bahrain company, Italy company, so we can, in those countries, we can actually do both. We provide both host nation, and we can comply with all the U.S. codes. So let me give you some examples of some of the challenges regarding design. The increased costs. Most of all of the European Union, and I believe also a couple of the Pacific countries, require that you cannot use U.S. materials and meet host nation code. For example, in Europe, all material has to be EU stamped, EU manufactured, and so when companies come in and say, oh, we're going to order this from the United States, you cannot do that. Legally, it cannot be installed in Europe, and legally, no technicians can install that in Europe. I mean, they can actually go to jail for doing that. And the follow-on is if someone does install it, no one can legally certify that. And let's just say someone installs it, certifies it, a year later, you need repairs. No company can legally come in and repair that unless you've got that original certification, which all goes back to having to use host nation materials throughout Europe. Another example, we come into a conflict. We were designing an ASOS facility in Aviano Air Base in northern Italy. And we run into a conflict with our U.S. design partner because we were tasked to do the host nation as well as the structural, because Italy has specific structural designs, particularly because of our earthquakes and everything that seems to be happening every other month. So our structural engineer did the design. The U.S. company looked at it and said, no, we can't accept that. The pillars are too large. You know, in the United States, we'd only use half that concrete. Our engineer did the calculations once again. We said, look, it has to be like this. So the U.S. partner was under a tight budget by the government. It was basically designed to budget. And he said, we're going to de-scope that from you because we got to reduce that. So they de-scoped it. And about 6 months later, after, 5 months after the design was finished, I get a call from NAVFAC and they said, Mike, we got a problem with our structural. And I said, well, what was it? And he said, we took the design, we put out the bid, we got a contractor, and he said he cannot build it because it's not host nation compliant. It doesn't meet code. And I said, do you have the design package in front of you? Pull it out, look at the structural design, and see who stamped and signed that for the host nation. And he pulled it out and he looked at it and he said, there is no host nation stamp on here. And I said, that is because Michael-Bruno was de-scoped on that. And the U.S. partner decided to come up with another solution. And he said, okay, thank you. That was the end of it. I heard 2 years later that the host nation ended up paying $1 million to fix the problem. So be sure if you get involved in international projects, listen to your host nation partner. Another problem we ran into was at naval support activity in Naples. We're doing a design for parameter lighting, and we did the cost comparison. We ran into a problem with UFC. UFC had certain specifications for the lights. We could not find a manufacturer in Europe that met all those specifications. So we went to the government and said, look, here are the 4 types of lights that we can use that, number 1, meet the host nation criteria, but they do not meet UFC. Each one of these meet different criteria, so we are asking you, government, to look at the different criteria and select what's more important to you. And they said, no, we don't do that. You're the DOR. You make that call. So I said, great. We made a call. We got to the pre-final and we submitted it, and they came back and said, we reject your lights. And my point of view was, you can't reject the lights because you gave us the authority to make the selection. This went back and forth for about a month. And finally, I said, stop. Let's sit down with the contract officer. Everyone, let's figure this out. And at the end, the government made a selection. And I explained to them, had you made a selection at the beginning based on host nation compliant conflict with UFC, we would have been finished by now. So communication is very, very important for 2 reasons. Number 1, if you're a contractor or a designer, it's going to save you time. Number 2, there's turnover of personnel overseas for the U.S. government. There's a lot of lost continuity in host nation compliance. I'm talking about things today that I talked about 5 years ago. And the reason is people turn over and they lose the continuity of what does it really mean. It also increases, host nation compliance also increases construction challenges and costs. You know, if you're in Europe, you're living in a European material world. You do not bring in, you know, forget that Buy America Act, throw it out the window. Everything must be made and acquired in Europe. It has to have that EU stamp on it. Compliance, we've talked about some examples of conflict in compliance. We had another problem at Aviano Air Base in northern Italy where we had to submit the design to the fire department. The fire department said, look, you didn't meet the national fire code. You've got to change it. They would not budge on that, and at the same time, the U.S. government would not budge because it was a hangar facility, and so at the end, we had to install a dual fire system, one to meet compliance with Italy and one to meet compliance with the United States. Similarly, in Germany and Landstuhl, we built a satellite terminal. We wired everything according to NEC. The German inspector came through and said, oh, no, we can't accept this. This doesn't meet DIN code. So we rewired everything to DIN code. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers inspector came and said, wait, this doesn't meet NEC. And I said, stop. Someone's got to make a decision because we're not going to change it again. So those are a couple of issues. I was talking about earlier, if you, in Europe, if you don't use EU materials, you technically cannot have certifications. You cannot bring in American certifiers. Only European certifiers can do that type of work, even if it's fire protection. We have an issue right now in Suda Bay where we're going back and forth because the project manager's only been in country for maybe 6 months, and he's come from the United States where he's done a lot of projects, but unfortunately his mentality is US focused, and he specifically is saying, we want these pumps from the United States. And I'm saying, if you do that, you are not legal in Greece, which Suda Bay is a little island in Crete, part of Greece. So I think we've resolved it. It's been going on for 3 months now. There are exceptions to this rule as far as host nation materials, primarily in the secured facilities. For example, we did a C4I building, and because of the facility, the requirements for security, we brought in US doors, and we had to get a waiver from the host nation committee. And in our design, we had to put a note that should the US government or US Navy ever leave that base and turn it back over to the host nation, the Navy is required to change the doors in that facility. And surprisingly enough, it even increases safety. Most countries have their own safety laws for construction. And as a result, as soon as the US government puts into an RFP, into a contract, that you must meet all host nation laws, you have to meet also their safety laws. So we received a contract from the Corps of Engineers in Huntsville to do a renovation of the 31st Medical Group Hospital in Italy. And so the Corps required an OSHA safety person, and the Italians required a host nation Italian safety person. So we ended up having to hire dual safety people that basically sat down and talked to each other all day, simply to meet both requirements. Host nation certified design safety manager. We also, in some of our projects, we have to get a host nation safety person, even if we have a US safety person to review the designs. And in most cases, the host nation person also has to stamp and certify them. The last point is very minor. It's specific, but it's a good example of the issues you run into when you're doing international projects. At the naval support activity in Naples, it's next to a commercial airport. The commercial airport just changed their laws, and it basically says if you're going to use a crane on either side, in other words, let's say 300 meters on either side of the runway, you have to submit documentation to the local government, and they have to approve it. Well, with all that documentation, you have to have your crane plans, your designs, where they're going to be. Basically, it costs an additional $5,000 for us to do all the documentation, $400 for the registration, and now we're waiting 4 months for their approval because the host nation takes no urgency. Even though the project was supposed to be completed 2 months ago, we are still waiting for approval. So keep this stuff in mind when you start scheduling. I mentioned that you also get yourself into dual legal systems. And I had a person from NAVFAC challenge me on this recently and said, oh no, you know, our contracts are US law. It says right on the contract, US jurisdiction, we're US government. And I said, look at that clause where it says the contractor is required to meet all host nation laws. And basically that means you're under the jurisdiction of whatever country you're working in. Even though it's a different language, different culture, and you may not know the laws, you are still liable for all the laws they have in that country. And I will give you an example. We did energy audits on all the Navy bases in Italy for Siemens. After we finished the work, we submitted everything to our contractor. Everything was good. And 2 months later, I get a call from Siemens saying, Mike, what's this company ABC? And I said, I've never heard of them. And they said that they worked with you in doing the energy audits, and now you're not paying them. And I said, well, who sent me a copy of that letter? So I looked at the letter and I recognized the name of the person that signed it. And I called the one consultant that worked with us because he brought his team of designers in, and we sat in my office and he said, okay, this is my staff from my office and this, and he introduced everybody and we moved forward. And I called him in and said, you know, is one of your individuals this person? He said, yeah. And I said, what's the problem? He's part of your staff. You billed us and we'll pay you. You know that. Oh, no, he's not part of my staff. He was somebody, a third company that I hired to get consultants. And so to make a long story short, basically that third company had no contract with this consultant of ours. They had not negotiated pricing. They had not done anything. But under the Italian law, it says that the prime contractor, in this case Siemens, is responsible. So it took us about a year because, you know, even though I said, great, come in, we'll negotiate a price, here's a certified check, thank you, go home. They didn't accept the check because ultimately what their goal was to get us out of the way, get everybody else out of the way, and the second phase of the work go directly to Siemens and get a contract. And, you know, ultimately Siemens sent a letter and said, you're never going to work with us again, take the check or you'll never get paid. So that just gives you an example of how you can get wrapped up in host nation laws without even, you know, doing anything wrong, trying to do everything right. So at the end of the day, basically, you know, host nation compliance is not just a code comparison between US and host nation and the most stringent applies. It has a major impact on DoD Europe as well as Pacific and other international locations in design as well as construction. You know, the traditional 1+1=2 pricing models no longer work in Europe. And I have talked to people. In fact, I had a meeting with a couple of people from SAM, me in the Pacific last week, and they said everything that you're experiencing there, we're experiencing in the Pacific. So you have to add host nation compliance into all the equations. If you're looking at an RFP, be sure to look for the wording. If it says meet host nation law, meet host nation compliance, those are the buzzwords. It's basically going to, it says you need to know a lot about that host nation before you start getting contracts to go in and build there. It's going to increase your cost, it's going to increase your time, and it's going to increase your challenges. I'm on a campaign right now where I'm going across Europe trying to educate government offices We had a meeting in Naples. We have another one in Spain. We've got another one in Aviano. And this is one of the issues because government has to know when they put that wording into an RFP what they are putting on the contractors. And the government keeps coming back to me saying, but why are the costs so high? You know, we budgeted and we came up with $2 million and we're getting offers at 3.5. We can't be that far off. They're not applying or they're not taking into consideration all that goes into host nation. Most of them will say, no, it's just a chart, a comparison. That is not the case. So basically, that's a quick 30-minute run through. And so now I'll open up the questions on the presentation, on international work, and hopefully I'll be able to have some answers for you.
Thanks, Michael. So we do have a couple questions that have come in. If any of our attendees have questions, please submit them through the Q&A box at the bottom right of your monitor. So the first question that came in is, you have noted a lot of issues that can come up regarding host nation compliance. How do we reduce our risk of these when bidding an RFP?
When you look at an RFP, the first thing you need to do is first find out what country it's in. A lot of companies come to me and say, oh yeah, we're going to bid this in Spain. And I don't want to be arrogant, but I tell them, no, you're not, because you cannot win. Make sure that you ask questions. In other words, when you get an RFP, look at it. Highlight anything that concerns host nation and any doubts you have. Send an RFI to the contract officer. Several times I've ran into companies that had issues after the fact. They went to the contract officer or the project manager for the government, and they said, well, why didn't you do an RFI? Why didn't you ask us then? You know, now you're on the hook. So make sure that you go through the RFP very well and you ask questions of the government during the bid phase. Then make sure that when you're at a kickoff meeting, you've won the contract, you sit down at the initial kickoff meeting, make sure you bring up any host nation issues, because this will help educate both the government and everybody involved in the project. For example, you might have a list of host nation questions, and once you go around and start doing your back and forth on design and everything else, someone in that group should say, we have some questions that we want to issue as a group, and go through that host nation list. And you might say, you realize we're doing this, for example, in Spain, and so we're under the European laws. All materials have to be purchased in Europe, and they all have to have EU stamps. They all have to be installed by European certified installers. They have to be certified. All the systems have to be certified by certified European engineers, architects, certified in Europe. Because those kind of questions will eliminate problems in the future. Because my experience is, for every 4 meetings, kickoff meetings that we attend, and we go through that list, at least 50% say, oh no, you don't have to have that. And then we look at them and say, yes, we do, because right here on page 10, it says, the contractor has to comply with all host nation law, and that's the host nation law. So get the questions out early in the project and keep open communication with the government so that they're aware of all the issues as well. As I say, I'll say it again, a lot of times they're not aware of all the issues. Next question.
All right. So our next question is, we have been exploring international opportunities, but your presentation puts a bit of fear in us. Would you suggest we go for it? And what would be your advice?
Start early. Don't wait until an RFP comes out, look at it and say, oh, look, here's a Department of State project that we can go after. My advice would be, if you're serious about international work, target a geographical area, either a region or a specific country. Start doing your investigations early. So first you're saying, okay, I want to work in Japan. Great, you've made that a target. Start doing your research. Who could you get in that country to be your partners? You know, do research and find out who would be some good, you know, what if you're going to need a design partner. Even if you have in-house design capabilities or a U.S. partner for design, you're going to need a host nation design partner. Start there. Because that, if you find the right design partner in a foreign country, they can lead you to subcontractors that can work with you. And if you do it early enough, that also gives you time to vet these companies, to sit down and meet with these people and come up with a strategy. In other words, you may be able to, depending on the country, you may be able to do just a teaming agreement and go after it. If you're, for example, if you're in Italy, Greece, Spain, Germany, you're going to have a partner and you're going to have a joint venture with them. So all of this takes time. But that would be my advice. Target a location that you want to go after, start doing the research, start finding some good partners, and the design partner can lead you to the good construction partners. And that way you should be in fairly good shape.
All right, so our next question is, it sounds like overseas work for the government has additional schedule and cost challenges inherently built into the process. Does the government factor both into their planning?
No. I can answer that specifically. We are, over the past year, we've done, I want to say 15 or 16 design build projects, between Africa, Middle East, and Europe. Every one of those projects go over budget and go over, government budget, and go over time. And many of the issues result from host nation, simply because the government has not taken into consideration the aspects of detail that have to go into it. For example, they don't take into consideration, you're going to have both a host nation and a U.S. design partner, so that's going to be additional cost. You're going to have host nation certifiers, additional cost. You know, all of these things, they do not take into consideration. One of the major challenges that I have right now is their model for A&E costs. Once you add host nation and DOR and everything else, design costs are just going up and up and up. And the government is still using, some RS means rates that are just ridiculous. I talked to one estimator last week and I said, the industry, the construction and design industry, they haven't used these rates since 1975. So I don't know what you're doing. So no, Barry, I have not seen any of them. For example, I mentioned that we received a contract from Huntsville Corps of Engineers for a hospital, Air Force hospital. The original scope of work that came out and was given to us, I looked at it and it had nothing about host nation in it. And I told the prime contractor who was in the United States, I said, I could sit back and say nothing, and we could get this award, and then I could turn around and say, oh, wait a minute, here's 5 pages of host nation stuff that they forgot to put into it. And then I can turn around and I can say, more time, more money. I said, but let's be honest. Go back to the government and say, you forgot host nation compliance. Please reach out to your European counterparts. They will tell you what's required. And we waited 2 weeks, RFP come back, 22 pages had been added about host nation compliance. So, depending on where the work is coming from, keep in mind that, government, a lot of government offices, especially if the contract is coming out of the United States, many of the host nation requirements are not even in those contracts. So you need to look at those things. Next question.
All right. We have a design project where we have host nation that says design. Sorry, I can't really see this. Hold on one sec. Okay. That the host nation says design should be ruled by NATO standards due to funding documents. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force wants to follow UFC. No one seems to want to make the decision. How do you force this issue and document it?
Good question. It obviously sounds like it is a U.S. contract, U.S. Air Force, but perhaps on a NATO installation. It would be nice to find out where that was located, maybe in Belgium or Italy or one of the other places where there's a lot of NATO. My point of view on this would be there are no real NATO standards that I'm aware of. Basically, they're European standards. And so basically they would say, okay, use European code. Now they may be saying NATO standards, but at the end they need European code. And in that case, you're dealing with the same thing. It comes down to they want US code, which is UFC, and they're going to want host nation code. So you're going to have to implement both. When we do designs, 99% of all the designs we do implement both host nation and US code. So at the same time, that means if you're designing from the United States, you're going to have to find a host nation partner, or at least if it's Europe, a European partner.
Okay. We have one more question. Do you know if government officials who contract for overseas work get special training on each country's unique challenges?
No, they do not. I was called a year ago by NAVFAC URASWA, and the person that called me was putting together some guidelines about host nation. And he said, Mike, you know, I've only been here for 2 months and they've tasked me to do this. And someone said to call you because here's what I have. Host nation compliance. Okay, number one, our priority is the Use America Act. So we need to buy all our materials from the United States. Number two, you know, we need to do a chart that shows European code, or in this case, Italy code and US code, and use the most stringent. Is that sufficient? And I said, take that and throw it away. I have a presentation that I'm going to show you, and then we're going to sit down and meet, because that is not at all what host nation is all about. And so we went through all of this, and hopefully they finalized their documents. I never saw if they finalized one or not. But no, they do not have, they are not trained on host nation country laws. Basically what my experience has taught me is each country, they take someone who's been there for a long time, take his knowledge, and then hope that he'll pass it on to somebody else. But unfortunately, that is rarely the case.
Okay. Well, it looks like that's about it for all the questions that we have today. Do you have any last thoughts on the subject or other lessons that you'd like to share with our attendees?
One more note on the question about the NATO. The NATO's intriguing me because I've never seen it with the NATO standards. What I would do in that case is I would prepare a letter to the contract office. And if in the contract it says NATO standards, I would ask the contracting officer, when you say NATO standards, are you referring to standards of the host nation as well as UFC? Because I think that's what, I just think the wording is wrong. So just to follow that. And I noticed there was one more question that popped up. And since we have a couple minutes, we can answer that. Do you see the one on tender method?
Yes, you can go ahead and read that.
It says tender method. Is it better to be in US format or host nation format? Our US Army Corps of Engineer client wants us to be, wants US because it says the GE covers complete system. Okay, now I see what you're doing. Germany is a complicated country because the Germans have an agreement with the United States government that, number one, they handle tenders. And so basically, there are some, I don't know the guidelines, but there's a guideline. And depending on what kind of work it is, for example, if it is new facilities, the U.S. government will prepare and they'll turn it over to the German government, and German government will then do the tendering. and a lot of times they'll put it in the German format. If you're not a German company, it's really difficult to work there because they basically put you in a position where you almost have to be a German company to work there. But if it's something that is controlled by the U.S. government and they can control, for example, repair contracts, job contracts, those kind of things, normally the U.S. government can do that and they use U.S. government formats. But for milcons, those kind of big projects, those are going to be handled by the German government.
All right, and we just actually had one more question come in. From where you sit and what you see, do you see a growth or decline in our overseas design and construction activity?
There is growth. I can tell you, like I said, I've been in this sector off and on for the past 40 years and full-time for at least the last 15, 16 years, and I have seen a lot of growth. Now, a lot of it is specialized growth. For example, in Eastern Europe, missile defense, those kind of things. But at the same time, there's a whole series of peripheral activities that go on for this. Our business, we have not invested from our initial investment when we opened the small business, and our initial investment was $5,000. And we've been able to, just by reinvesting the profits, we've been able to open, 3 international companies. So yes, I would say that there is growth, and one should look at, if you're positioned correctly as a company in the United States, one should look at the international sector because it is a good way to expand your business.
All right, that's it, I think, for our Q&A. So I will let you make your final remarks.
Okay, well, first of all, on behalf of SAME and the Military Engineer Presents webinar series, I want to thank everyone for participating. It's been fun for me. Hopefully you've learned something. In addition, if you're interested in overseas work, I also want to let you know that SAME, Department of State Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization, and the Bureau of Overseas Building Operations, the famous OBO, there's going to be an industry day in Washington, a face-to-face on October the 5th. And, you look at the slide here, it gives you all the information. It's going to be one of those one-day events where an actual government customer that works overseas primarily, they're the guys who do the embassies, the consulates. We've done a lot of work for them. They're a good company, good agency. The only challenge you have with OBO and the U.S. Department of State is everybody thinks they're the boss. The ambassador's the boss, the facility manager's the boss, OBO is the boss. But once you understand how they work, you can get a lot of business from them. And once you work with them and you work successfully, they like return business. So there's the website right there, the SAME.org website /2017 IBOW. And for those participants of this webinar, there's a code that you can put in, DOS_TME, and you get a 25% discount. So I recommend that to everybody. And if you have any questions farther on, feel free to send me an email, whatever. I'll be happy to communicate with you, and I wish you all the best.